All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is Galen Barbos with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Welcome to today's webinar where we'll be presenting findings from a new report that discusses current and emerging practices related to the treatment of distributed solar in utility planning. This report involved contributions from a large number of folks listed on the slide here, and you'll be hearing from a number of us over the next hour. Before we begin, though, let me cover just the standard housekeeping items. First, the slides that we'll be presenting on the webinar here today are already available online. We'll provide the web address later on the last slide where you can download the presentation as well as the report itself. But for those of you that can't wait, if you do go to the emp.lbl.gov website, you should probably be able to navigate your way to this report from there, and you can find both the slide deck and the report. So that's number one. Number two, you all are in listen-only mode. We are planning to save a good amount of time at the end for some Q&A. So please enter any questions that you might have into the chat window on the screen. And if you can do that as we go along, we'll kind of queue them up for the Q&A session at the end. So I'm going to give just a very quick overview of the project, and we'll then hand it off to others to really dig into the substance of the report. In terms of the basic context and motivation for this work, it's probably self-evident to most of you on the line today. Many regions are, of course, beginning to see quite rapid growth in distributed solar, and that growth has important implications for utility planning and also, and by extension, for solar evaluation and the value of solar itself. Because this is still a relatively new phenomenon, though, the techniques surrounding how to incorporate distributed solar into utility planning are still very much evolving. And so the purpose of our paper and this presentation is to catalog and assess current practices and to identify examples of some innovative techniques that are currently being used. And so our approach involved reviewing roughly 30 or so recent planning studies. These included utility integrated resource plans, regional transmission planning studies, and also distribution plans. So in other words, we were looking really at planning processes that span the entirety of the electric network, from the bulk power system down to the distribution network. And in reviewing each of those studies, we focused specifically on a core set of methodological issues related to distributed solar. And those core methodological issues kind of form the basis for the structure of the report. The report in our presentation today is organized around the 9 issues identified here. And you might think about these sort of more as themes that overlap with one another to some degree, but in each case involve a distinct set of questions and methodological approaches. So rather than read these off, I think it's probably best just to jump right in. So we're going to start with the topic of distributed PV forecasting. In terms of accounting and planning for DPV, this obviously is a fundamental threshold step. I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague Yo Seal, who will summarize the range of DPV forecasts considered within the planning studies that we reviewed. So Yo, take it away.
Thank you very much, Galen. So getting a good sense of how much distributed PV will grow over the next 5 to 15 years is obviously important because the expected DPV capacity can be a very influential input value in a number of resource transmission and distribution planning exercises. On this figure here, we show the range of DPV forecasts in the near term and in the long term as a percentage of retail sales. The near-term forecasts are for 2020 and are shown in the dark blue, and the long-term forecasts are for 2030 and are shown in the light blue color. The range covered by a bar indicates uncertainty, and you see that uncertainty is often quite substantial, even in the near term of just about 5 years. we categorize the methods used by utilities to develop these forecasts into four broad categories on which Ben will expand in just a moment. In the written report, we have a similar graph to this one as it is just shown here that explicitly categorizes forecasts by methods instead of geography. The first approach extrapolates DPV growth based on recent historic trends and is used, for example, by Nevada Power. The second approach forecasts DPV growth based solely on program or policy goals, which was used, for example, by APS, TEP, and Georgia Power. The third approach stipulates the future DPV quantity in a what-if scenario, and examples are Duke, Indiana, Entergy, Louisiana, and Hawaii. The upper bounds of these scenarios can be quite high, as for example, Entergy, Louisiana's distributed disruption scenario, or Duke Energy, Indiana's stakeholder-inspired increased customer choice scenario. Finally, the fourth and last approach uses a customer adoption model, and examples include the lower end of the PG&E forecast and forecasts from Puget Sound Energy, Pacific Core, WEC, and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council. To give you a point of reference, the EIA's recent forecast of the national average DPV penetration is about 0.5 to 1% of retail sales by 2020 and 0.8 to 2% by 2030. A number of utilities, as you can see, only used a single forecast of DPV adoptions. Some of these utilities were in regions that have yet to see substantial growth in DPV, and future adoption rates are expected to remain relatively low, for example, the northwest of the United States. But some utilities in areas where DPV penetration is expected to be above the national average also only used a single forecast. For example, Nevada Power, Public Service New Mexico, ISO New England, and NISO. In contrast, some other utilities considered a broad range of potential DPV forecasts, reflecting the uncertainty in future deployment rates, even in the near term, or the desire of planners to understand the impact of higher rates of adoption. Less than half of the utilities consider DPV penetration levels beyond 1% of sales by 2020, even at the high end of their expected ranges. While some of these utilities are in areas with lower solar installation, like the Northwest, for example, other utilities are in regions with high solar installation, like the South. At these forecasted lower penetration rates, DPV is less likely to have a substantial impact on planning decisions in the near term, though longer-term impacts may still be important. We compare the utility forecast to the range of forecasts from several industry participants, including forecasts from Green Tech Media, Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and NREL's D-Solar forecast. The thin line in orange shows the range of these third-party forecasts. We observe that for some utilities, their upper forecast bound is below the range of these third-party forecasts. For example, the APS DPV forecast for 2030 is much lower than the forecast from NREL's D-Solar model. This is because APS forecast is primarily driven by RPS requirements for distributed generation, whereas NREL's D-Solar forecast is driven by customer economics. Similarly, Georgia Power's forecast is primarily based on a program goal, resulting in a forecast that is lower than NREL's D-Solar forecast. One takeaway from this analysis is that utilities are often not considering as high of a solar future as some third-party forecasts suggest are plausible. We believe these third-party forecasts are helpful, at least for benchmarking the range of future DPV adoption for planning purposes. And it's my pleasure now to hand over the mic to Ben Sigrin from NREL, who will explain to us some of the methodological differences between the various forecasting methods.
Thank you, Yo. This is Ben Sagren from NREL. In the planning studies that we examined, we did encounter a range of methods that were used to forecast DPV deployment, as you can see on the slide here. These methods spanned a wide spectrum of sophistication and conversely the data that they used. And this, of course, translates into the precision of the method itself and the type and kind of sensitivity analyses that can be conducted. So as a practitioner in this space, I run the NREL's solar model. I think it's important to remember two things about this field of study. The first one is that forecasting technology adoption is, to some degree, inherently uncertain, because in doing so, we are essentially trying to project human behavior with all its warts and wrinkles and uncertainties. So the second point I think that we need to consider too is that, as Galen mentioned earlier, this is an emerging area. Though we have been forecasting other metrics in planning studies like peak load for decades at this point, the experience with DPV and other distributed generation resources is more limited, and the methods available are more limited as well. So perhaps 20 years from now, forecasting DPV deployment will be an essential part of all planning studies with an obvious and validated set of methodologies that planners can use and take off the shelf. But in my opinion, we're not quite there yet. So that said, of the methods that we examined, we consider explicit customer adoption modeling to be the current best-in-class method that's available today for planners to use in forecasting DPV adoption. So customer adoption models explicitly use historical DPV deployment, location-specific technical potential, and also various economic considerations, as well as end-user behaviors, as all constituting part of the predictive factors in a model. These can be there can be quite a lot of data at times to calibrate these models. Next slide, please. Can you please move to the next slide?
It might just take a second to catch up. Ben, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Slide 7. Yeah, thank you. Sorry for that. So again, since a large portion of DPV is based on customer adoption decisions, we see a growing role for customer adoption models in planning studies. And though the methods may vary, there is currently sort of a three-step process that most practitioners tend to use when they're trying to forecast these quantities. The first step is a detailed screening of the target population, filtering out for non-appropriate households or households that couldn't site rooftop solar at their own homes or businesses, and from there generate a technical potential number, meaning the upper bound of the feasible amount of capacity that could be deployed in a territory. The second step is to use a willingness to adopt curve that converts PV economics to the market potential or the sort of threshold amount that could eventually adopt. And these are usually expressed in terms of the percentage of the technical potential. And then the final step is to project forward, to step forward using typically an S-type of curve, as you can see on the bottom right, that produces annual adoption rates given the market potential, where the Bass diffusion model and the Fisher-Pry model are two of the most popular options today, although I should say there are many types of other specifications that are being explored. So I think the ultimate advantage of this type of approach, of this explicit modeling approach, is that it does allow a linkage between several of the uncertainty factors that we know drive DPV markets, as well as linking these to the ultimate penetration rate. So there are there are some limitations with the existing customer adoption models. For example, in my opinion, there's more work to be done in quantifying the uncertainty of these types of forecasts and eventually driving down the confidence interval of our forecast. As well as I think there's still more work to be done in identifying the key factors that are predictive of the adoption decision. So thank you for your time, and Galen, I think it's your microphone now.
This is actually Andrew. I'll take over from here. So this is Andrew Mills from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And thanks, Ben, for that. It's clear from this discussion that there is still, no matter what, going to be some uncertainty in the distributed PV adoption forecasts. So in this next section, what we start to do is ask, how do planners deal with this uncertainty in their planning studies. We saw a range of approaches that were used in the planning studies. Some of them included only a single forecast of distributed PV and really didn't address at all this uncertainty in DPV adoption. A few, on the other hand, created candidate portfolios and then tested the cost effectiveness of these static portfolios under different levels of DPV adoption. In this approach, the different levels of DPV adoption really only affected the dispatch of the resources in the portfolios, but they didn't change the plan in response to that increased or decreased amount of distributed PV adoption. Alternatively, a large number of the studies that we looked at in our sample used a capacity expansion model to develop different generation portfolios for each different scenario of DPV adoption. This approach both accounts for the changes in dispatch and for the changes in the generation resources with more or less DPV adoption. We refer to these as per scenario plans or scenario-specific plans. Finally, a few of the studies used multiple per scenario plans to help them identify trigger events that would change the timing and need for other resources identified in their plans. These diagrams on the slide, slide number 10, illustrate how planners developed scenario-specific plans. On the left, you see that a higher DPV forecast can lead to a lower net load. The plan with the higher DPV adoption then, the one on the bottom right, results in a deferral or elimination of plants that would otherwise be needed in the low PV scenario. Capacity expansion models like Strategist, System Optimizer, or Aurora were used in 9 of the utility resource studies to develop scenario-specific plans with different levels of DPV adoption. Although we saw this approach primarily used in resource planning, we also found a few examples, like in Hawaii, where planners identified transmission needs in a low DPV scenario that could be deferred in a high DPV scenario. The question then is, what do you do with these different plans? One option that we saw was to compare the plans across the various scenarios to identify trigger events that would lead to changes in the preferred plan. This example here shows how PacifiCorp used various distributed generation forecasts to identify changes to the near-term and long-term resource acquisition strategy if the distributed generation adoption were to be lower or higher than what they had included in their base forecast. The next methodological issue is the inclusion of distributed PV as a resource option in the planning studies. In the previous slides, the planners were primarily thinking about distributed PV as an exogenous factor that impacts just the needs of the utility. But in this case, in this section, we'll go through how a few utilities considered distributed PV as a resource option that could be proactively deployed to help them meet needs. On slide 13, we see one way that distributed PV could be considered as a resource option, which was used by LADWP and Northern States Power, for example, was to include it as a resource in a candidate portfolio, as shown in the figure above. Here, planners could estimate the present value of the revenue requirement for each plan and then rank them to find the least cost alternative. Another option was to simply characterize distributed PV as an option in the capacity expansion model and then let the model identify the quantity of distributed PV that would minimize costs. We saw that with Tennessee Valley Authority, HECO, and Puget Sound Energy, where they all included distributed PV as an option in their capacity expansion models. The primary challenge in including distributed PV as a resource option is deciding how to represent the costs and benefits of distributed PV, and then how to distinguish it from other resource options. In particular, how to distinguish it from utility scale PV. Distributed PV has different cost, performance, and potentially different contribution to resource adequacy than a utility scale PV plant. And since it's on the distribution system, sited closer to load, it can also be characterized by avoided losses, avoided transmission, and avoided distribution. Very few of the studies that we saw included all of these characteristics. In our sample of studies, we only saw PG&E include all of these different characteristics. Distributed PV can also be considered as a resource in transmission planning and distribution planning. The California Distribution Resource Plans and the New York REV process are working toward developing location-specific cost-benefit analysis in order to help determine if and where distributed PV, amongst other resources, could be a cost-effective resource. The next section explores how planners account for the variable and uncertain nature of generation from distributed PV within these planning studies. On slide 15, we see that overall there's an evolving set of methods for capturing this important aspect of distributed PV in utility plans. Almost all of the studies that we looked at appeared to develop an hourly profile of solar generation that can capture the changes in the output of distributed PV due to the changing position of the sun and also due to cloud cover. Hourly generation profiles can be used to capture some of the effects of distributed PV, including things like multiple hour ramping needs and the potential for overgeneration events. Those are where we have thermal plants that can't be backed down further to help absorb more solar generation. A number of studies use results from detailed operational integration studies to assess the costs associated with sub-hourly variability and uncertainty that aren't captured with just the hourly profiles alone. The range of these operational integration cost estimates from the studies in our review is shown in the top right. Finally, the contribution of distributed PV to reliability is based on its capacity credit. This represents the contribution to resource adequacy from distributed PV divided by its nameplate capacity. Almost all utilities assigned a capacity credit to distributed PV, as shown in that bottom figure. Two winter peaking utilities, Puget Sound Energy and the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, assigned a capacity credit of effectively 0, while the range in the other regions was from about 26 to 50% of the nameplate capacity. The methods used by the utilities to calculate this contribution to reliability were not always discussed, though it's generally accepted that methods like the effective load carrying capability are among the most rigorous methods for calculating capacity credit. Now I'll move on to predicting the location of distributed PV adoption, which, in addition to the quantity and timing, is important in transmission and distribution planning. On slide 17, we see that we found 3 general approaches for trying to assess where distributed PV adoption will occur. Some of the planners assumed that distributed PV adoption would occur in proportion to the load. Others assumed that places that have seen adoption of distributed PV would see the most in the future. And then a few used characteristics of customers to help them predict where adoption would occur. Analysis of previous distributed PV adoption patterns indicates that factors like demographics do influence distributed PV adoption. As demographic factors tend to cluster in different neighborhoods and cities throughout a service territory, distributed PV adoption patterns are unlikely to only follow the load. For a simple assumption, DPV adoption is more likely to occur in areas where it's already starting to be adopted. And this type of assumption was used by New York ISO, ISO New England, and INHECO. But if resources are available to conduct a more refined assessment, a propensity to adopt DPV analysis can be done by estimating the detailed demographic and household information of customers. Then this propensity to adopt can then be used to identify particular locations where distributed PV growth is expected. Better estimates of where DPV adoption is likely to occur can help improve estimates of the impacts of distributed PV on the transmission and distribution system. For example, in its distribution resource plan, PG&E developed a logistic regression to help them predict the probability of a customer adopting distributed PV. For residential customers, the factors that are used to predict adoption included information about housing, customer demographics, electricity consumption, and geography. They then fit this regression using information about previous distributed PV adopters and then apply it to all customers to help them allocate distributed PV growth to individual feeders. In the next 3 slides, what I'll do is I'll briefly touch on a few highlights of how we saw utilities assess the impact of distributed PV on transmission and distribution investments. On slide 20, we see that one of the drivers of transmission and distribution investment is really the growth in the peak load. A number of planning entities are assessing the impact of distributed PV on the peak load in transmission planning studies. ISO New England, for example, reduces the summer peak load used in transmission planning studies by 26% of the distributed PV nameplate capacity. PJM similarly reduces peak load based on their estimates of distributed PV generation in the peak hour of the 10 highest load days in the previous year. This lower peak demand with distributed PV can then help defer the need to upgrade transmission and distribution assets, therefore lowering utility costs as shown in this figure. Growing deployment of distributed PV, however, raises concerns regarding impacts to distribution systems that were originally designed only to deliver power from substations to customers. What we see is a number of distribution planners are beginning to undertake hosting capacity analysis to help them streamline interconnection process and better inform stakeholders, developers, and customers. Hosting capacity refers to the amount of distributed PV that can be interconnected to the distribution system without violating any operating limits, including voltage, thermal, and protection limits. Some regions have specific policy goals to allow for more customer choice, including installation of a distributed PV system. Under these circumstances, the utility may need to proactively plan to expand the hosting capacity of the distribution system in a least cost manner. This chart here on the top right shows the distribution upgrade costs per unit of PV nameplate capacity to accommodate different levels of distributed PV penetration on 14 representative feeders in the Dominion, Virginia system. Up to the hosting capacity, the upgrade cost is zero. But beyond the hosting capacity, upgrades to the distribution system are required to help remain within the operating limits. The upgrade costs in this case are from traditional measures like reconductoring, adding additional phases, or adding voltage regulating devices. The chart on the bottom here shows the cost for one of the representative feeders, which is cluster 11 in the previous figure. And this is now the cost if new emerging technologies are assumed to be available. The availability of advanced inverters capable of supporting voltage through power factor controls can increase the hosting capacity and also lower the upgrade costs. The study authors note, however, that taking advantage of this advanced inverter control requires that there's system-wide telecommunications and distribution management systems that are neither currently available at Dominion nor included in these upgrade cost estimates. The next section of the report focuses on how planners can account for the impact of distributed PV on power system losses. Siting PV near loads can avoid losses that would otherwise occur between generation at the bulk power system level and consumption at the consumer level, though it's possible for distributed PV to increase losses in some circumstances. One important characteristic of losses is that they increase with the square of the loading of the lines. This means that load reductions during peak times can reduce losses more than at other times. To fully capture the impact of distributed PV on losses requires detailed modeling of loading on individual circuits. We did see one utility in their resource plan that did a side analysis of a few circuits to investigate this issue, but most appeared just to use the average loss rate over the entire system. One example that stands out as going further to characterize losses was Arizona Public Service. APS used a time-differentiated loss rate that accounted for the variation in average energy losses by month, and then separately characterized the losses during the peak times. In their case, peak losses were about 11.7% as compared to the 6.3% average energy losses. In the next section, we also looked at how planners can account for the fact that the costs and benefits of solar can change as more solar is added to the system. Given the relatively small amount of distributed PV forecast by planners in many of the studies, we didn't see much of a detailed discussion of how costs and benefits of solar can change with increased penetration. A few notable exceptions to this were Georgia Power and LADWP. Georgia Power estimated the value of solar for various tranches of solar. The chart in the bottom right shows their estimate of the capacity credit of solar for each 1,000 megawatt tranche of solar. The capacity credit starts at about 45% of nameplate capacity, which is similar to the range that we saw before for other studies. But then, as you add more solar, it decreases to about 0% by the time you've gotten to 7,000 megawatts of solar. In the same way, they estimated the energy value, avoided T&D costs, and avoided losses for various tranches of solar. Unfortunately, a lot of the details are redacted, so we don't know exactly what some of their findings were and what some of the methods were for estimating these differences. Another interesting factor was LADWP looked at electric car charging during the day as a way that could help mitigate challenges with overgeneration that we saw with high solar and low load days. Another factor that we've heard a lot about is one way to potentially stem declines in the value of solar with higher penetration is to bundle distributed PV with other enabling technologies such as storage or load controls. We did see a few scattered examples of pilot studies or other references to smaller analysis of these technologies, but we didn't really see clear best practices on how to evaluate these options in planning studies. And we see that this is an area where more work might be particularly useful. Finally, with growth in distributed PV resources and other distributed resources, we see a need for increased coordination among planning functions that have tended to occur in isolation. One approach is to ensure that resource transmission and distribution planners are using consistent scenarios, assumptions, and data. California, for example, coordinates many of the planning assumptions among the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and the Independent System Operator. Similar coordination activities are taking place at the ISO and New York ISO, ISO New England, and New York ISO. But beyond passing similar assumptions between different planning entities, we summarize a few examples where planners are more tightly linking different planning functions by iterating between distribution planning and resource planning. One of the challenges with this is that resource planning has a long time horizon with many different investment options, whereas distribution planning tends to have a shorter planning horizon but has a huge amount of variation in location-specific needs. New emerging tools are being developed to help inform planning from the feeder up by leveraging automation of planning analysis and, in some cases, the use of high-performance computing. Finally, we note that retail rate design plays an important role in influencing the quantity and timing of distributed PV adoption. Rate design may also need to be integrated into these different planning functions more tightly in order to inform rate design proceedings and planning proceedings. In summary, here's a few of the highlights of the innovative practices that we saw across methodological elements. We covered the emerging use of customer adoption forecasts for distributed PV forecasting, developing scenario-specific plans and trigger events to identify when conditions might be sufficiently different from the expected level to help change the plan. And we also talked about interesting approaches for using household or customer level data to quantify the propensity to adopt distributed PV in order to develop feeder-by-feeder forecasts. We also found some examples of distributed PV being included in the peak load forecasts for transmission planning, with plans to include it in distribution planning. We also found a few examples of utilities starting to use this hosting capacity analysis to proactively identify distribution upgrade needs. And we'll soon begin follow-on analysis that will show how using some of these innovative practices noted here that might be able to meaningfully affect planning study results. In particular, our future work may focus on innovative practices for forecasting distributed PV adoption, examining the robustness of decisions to distributed PV uncertainty, and also in considering distributed PV as a resource. With that, I'll put up this slide here that has contact information and then also a link to our reports page. And from there, we'll open it up to some of the questions that have come in.
Thank you, Andrew, for this great presentation. We've got a couple of questions coming in already, but as we do have some time available, please submit additional questions via the chat box, as the lines are going to remain to be muted, so just use the chat box for that. Maybe the first question going out to Ben Sigrin at NREL, as you talked about the different models. One model described the diffusion model that had an S-shaped adoption curve. And one listener asked how in this S-shaped adoption curve early adopters are represented and whether one may not argue for sharp uptick in the beginning as the early adopters rush into the market, and then a little bit of a market calming as those early adopters have been already satisfied, but costs have not yet come down sufficiently for broad uptake. So could it maybe look like a little bit more like a U shape instead of an S shape, this adoption curve?
Yeah, thanks. This is Ben. Well, I mean, certainly we don't know the future. We don't know the future trends of adoption. So it's certainly possible that the true shape of adoption would be different from an S shape. And I would also say that those S shapes are meant to be stylized, and they're not necessarily meant to follow the exact trend of adoption over time. But what I would say is that if we look at the prior diffusion of technologies, customer technologies, they have generally tended to follow an S shape. So, while the initial adopters are the first uptakers, conceptually, theoretically, the idea is that those initial adopters communicate the benefits of a technology to their peers who might not have been early adopters, and those in turn, so it sort of spreads through a population in an epidemic style, if you will. But I would just say, yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do at NREL is we track penetration rates for each state and for each utility. And from those shapes, we try to estimate the BAS parameters. And so, we acknowledge that the rate and shape of diffusion is going to be fluid over time. And so we try to update our models, at least on an annual basis, to reflect those kinds of market trends.
Thank you, Ben. If I may follow up with one additional question that was targeted to some extent at the DSOLAR modeling. One listener asked whether or not there's any connection between the DSOLAR model and the broader resource planning model from NREL, or whether these are totally separate modeling efforts.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So no, we do try to link these models. So if you divide the power system into those two spheres, the distributed scale and the bulk power system, so we have a model at NREL called READS, which is our bulk power capacity expansion model. And those two models are linked where the two models are communicating back and forth in terms of making sure that the assumptions are aligned. I think we're doing a decent job at communicating the transmission level integration. I think one area that we need to do better at NREL at least is understanding distribution level questions. So we don't have, for example, public data on each feeder in the U.S., and we don't know the true hosting capacity for each and every feeder in the U.S. So I would say that part is still an emerging part of the science. So anyways, yeah, we do try to communicate them, but it's something that we're working on as well.
Thanks. And one last question for you, Ben. One person asked whether we could speak a little bit more about the general future work that is planned by LBNL and NREL in kind of the year 2 effort of this research project.
Yeah, so I want to hand the mic to my colleague True Mai, who's helping us plan out the year 2 effort. True?
Yeah, this is true. Thanks for that question. In the second year, what we hope to do is exactly this question that the questioner has here, is what is the impact quantitatively on different DPV futures would be on the portfolio and resource selection for the utility planner looking at utility scale assets. Does that mean a reduction if you are forecasting a large amount of DPP in other generation needs, whether they be fossil or renewable generation needs? So in that work, we hope to combine the perspective from the D-Solar modeling that does the customer adoption for DPV versus our resource planning model and potentially other models as well that takes more on the bulk power system perspective and evaluate how portfolios might change when you consider different aspects of DPV, forecasting being one of them, but the other aspects that are evaluated in this current work, like the capacity credit, like the lack of dispatchability, would also be factored in there as well.
Great. Okay, we have another question that just asks if we could provide an example or two of utility resource plans where forecasts of customer-sited solar have led to changes in the central station power plants. And that can be either through deferrals or through elimination of that. And the answer to that is that, in these cases where the planners developed scenario-specific plans, in the case where you added distributed PV, based on that capacity credit, you would potentially have the ability to defer or eliminate some of those future thermal power plant needs. So really that capacity credit is one of the key drivers in helping to identify how much of the power plants can be deferred or eliminated. Some specific examples where you could identify the impact that distributed PV would have on some of the power plants. One of them was from PacifiCorp, where in a high distributed generation case, you would end up potentially deferring the need to build some combined cycle power plants, and then some of the later ones maybe would be eliminated altogether. Another example that we saw was in Hawaii in their 2013 IRP that they had a wide variety of scenarios that they evaluated, some of them with much higher distributed solar adoption than in others, and they used a capacity expansion model to test each of those different scenarios in a variety of ways. And if you were to compare between the high solar and the low solar cases, you would see that there'd be some differences in the generation needs from that. So those are two particular examples that I could point to. But again, the use of those capacity expansion models helps to identify those opportunities. Another question here is related to the ability of distributed PV to be able to reduce distribution capacity requirements. And the questioner raises the fact that IEEE's current standard that applies to distributed resources interconnection, the 1547, requires that distributed resources trip and remain off at a minimum of 1 to 5 minutes following a disturbance, such as a temporary feeder fault. And so the question is how can PV reduce the distribution capacity requirements based on that? And what we've seen is that there's a few cases where the distribution planners are basing their distribution planning needs using what they've seen as the peak load on those feeders, and sort of looking at historical peak loads and then doing some sort of analysis to project that further. And in some cases, because you had increased distributed PV on that, the peak load that they would be seeing at the substation level, for example, would be reduced by that distributed PV. And so that then affects potentially the forecast that they're making going forward, that they would be now forecasting a lower peak load, and then that can then translate into a different amount of distribution capacity needs going forward. So I think there's some examples that we've seen where based on the methods that are being used, that can result in potentially deferral. But I think this is also just an area that there's continues to be a lot of trying to sort out what the right methods are, what will be the impact of some of the changes that have been proposed to things like the 1547 standard. And then also, one of the challenges that you have is that when you're talking about trying to defer distribution capacity needs, that you're talking about a fairly local area, and so benefits of things like geographic diversity, which might help smooth out the output, start to be reduced when you're talking about a limited set of distributed PV resources in a very small localized area. So I think that there are some challenges with being able to defer distribution capacity, but then we have a few examples where that is happening. Just see if there's a couple other questions we can get to here. Okay, here's another question, which is that it might be useful for Galen to help out with this one. So the question is, does the degree of industry restructuring that's taken place in a particular jurisdiction influence how the utility goes about planning for distributed PV, and should it?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most basic answer to that is, of course, in restructured regions, the utilities themselves are really only planning for the distribution network, and so I mean, there's just sort of a more limited set of kind of planning and optimization objectives there. But I mean, I think probably most of the same kind of methodological issues that we covered here are applicable to distribution system planning just as they are to generation system planning. I don't know, Andrew, I mean, I might kick it back to you just to comment on whether there were any of those kind of 9 core issues that we covered that are perhaps sort of really only germane in a context where the utility is planning for the bulk power system, but not in a situation where they're planning for just the distribution network.
Yeah, you know, I think one that comes to mind in particular is this question of considering distributed PV as a resource option that can be used to help meet needs. And if you're a utility that's only a wires-only utility, there are benefits to the bulk power system that distributed PV can bring, but those are potentially kind of outside of the normal purview of the planning that you'd be doing. So you'd primarily be focusing on the sort of the distribution and transmission planning functions, and less on doing it as a resource planning. And so in that case, you might kind of be basing those other values off of what that resource might be able to earn in the market or something like that. And so that just raises one of the challenges. Whereas in a vertically integrated utility, you're able to sort of look at the ability to defer your need to build other generation resources in addition to the impacts that it might have on the distribution and transmission. So I think that's one area where in particular that sticks out to me. And one of the related questions to that is, what elements of distributed PV are most important to include in a cost-benefit analysis for determining this? And I think one of the things that we saw was that a number of the utilities highlight the fact that distributed PV can cost, in most cases, does cost more than a utility-scale PV plant. So the capital cost difference is notable, and that's something that has to be, in order to justify the utility procuring distributed PV in lieu of utility-scale PV, you have to justify that based on the other attributes of a distributed resource. And so that's important to then come up with things like, the avoided losses or avoided transmission and distribution capacity, to estimate that, to see if that's sufficient to overcome that capital cost difference. And I think that those are some of the main pieces of the analysis that you need to consider. The other factor that's different about distributed PV, though, is that in some cases, it's not necessarily the utility going out and procuring distributed PV, but it might be the utility including a program that would enable or encourage customers to be the ones that go out and purchase that resource. And so in that case, you don't necessarily have to compare the capital cost of that distributed PV, but more what would be the reduction in revenue, for example, because it's the net metering program essentially that covers the cost of of that distributed PV resource. So the perspective and who sort of is the owner of it also becomes somewhat important to that. And we have a section in the report that kind of goes through some of these different cost tests that can be used in cost effectiveness and in what situations one might be more appropriate than another.
If I may jump in here real quick, one questioner or one participant asked whether or not there was a single source of all these integration studies and IRP studies, or whether we had to, track them all down independently. And unfortunately, we did have to look at all of them independently. That was kind of one of the major contributions of this work. But if there's a particular utility that you're interested in, it's usually on their website. The documents are posted, including other discussion and documents, so that came about in the overall deliberation process for these integrated resource plans.
Here's a question that would maybe be helpful for the NREL folks again to jump in on, which is that we've kind of characterized distributed PV adoption in some cases, particularly in the forecasting, to be somewhat of an exogenous factor that is driven by customer choice. But to some degree, the adoption of distributed PV is going to be driven in part by issues like rate design or net metering program design that are actually something that the utility has control over to some degree. So although we've kind of characterized it as exogenous, there is some ability for the utility to control that. And so if you guys want to just talk a little bit about the role that rate design might play in adoption forecasts and then also maybe in planning.
Yeah, thanks. I definitely agree with that comment. I think that something that maybe wasn't explicit in our slides was that, yes, absolutely, when you're forecasting DPV, it's wholly conditional on the projected economics of the DPV system. Some of those things are exogenous, like technology cost and performance, but many of them are very tightly interlinked with rate design, like you said, net metering, which has come up. So yeah, absolutely, I do agree that rate design and how those rates translate into DPV economics is very influential in the adoption forecasting.
Just to add to that a bit, this is true from NREL, and I don't know, and Andrew, maybe you could answer whether or not we found any of this in the studies that we looked at, but that connection between kind of the rate making versus the utility scale resource planning is a gap there. In other words, there's not a lot of interactivity in that, so there might be some opportunities that benefit both the customer and the utility if that gap is narrowed.
Yeah, right. So we didn't see, we saw some cases where the forecast of distributed PV might be affected by the assumptions about retail rate escalation, for example. So if retail rate were assumed to escalate at a faster rate, you might see faster adoption of distributed PV based on their forecasting method. But we didn't see any of the forecasts attempt to evaluate rate design or net metering program design as something that would affect the forecast. And so, as Drew said, that's an area where you have important decisions that the utility might be making that would affect the adoption and then also planning needs, but those explicit linkages haven't really been made in the planning documents that we saw so far. So that is an area that might be useful for more work. A question about, we mentioned that in characterizing distributed PV as a resource, that PG&E was one example that we saw where they had covered a lot of those, pretty much all of the different aspects of avoiding losses and distribution upgrades. And so this part of it comes from analysis that was used as part of the PG&E's bundled procurement plan, which is what we included in our sample. And as part of that, PG&E used to create the scenarios something called the RPS Calculator, and some of the assumptions that came through from that RPS Calculator are used to evaluate the cost effectiveness of distributed resources in comparison to other renewable resources that might be used to meet the RPS needs. And so that calculator estimates based on the location at a fairly granular level. So these are kind of more at the utility IOU level. It estimates the avoided losses, and then also what the avoided transmission or increased transmission needs would be, and then also a distribution deferral need. So those are assumptions that were kind of done at a high level and then included in this calculator to then help evaluate the cost effectiveness of distributed resources versus other resources. So that RPS calculator has a lot of the documentation and assumptions that went into that. We're getting down to just a few more questions here. This question asks, and maybe a few of us can chime in on this, is based on what we've seen, what's the biggest advancement in planning to account for distributed energy resources, and where is the biggest need for improvement in DER representation? And so where is there sort of the biggest ground to make up? NREL folks, do you want to jump in with your thoughts first?
Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of them here. I think having DPV as a resource option is one thing that perhaps hasn't been integrated in many of the capacity expansion models that are being used for utility planning. And the exception that you pointed out there, Andrew, about the RPS calculator in California is one perhaps counterexample, but that seems to be the exception more than the norm. And to do that evaluation would require considering the various aspects of DPV that we've talked about in this paper, the changes in those values with different penetration levels and with different changes in the broader electricity system as well. So my personal opinion is integrating these factors that we kind of all know and think about in isolation into a single framework is something that really doesn't exist right now. So that's one area. The other area is about hosting capacity and the effects on the distribution side. I think states like California and utilities in California and in New York have started to explore that, but that's certainly a nascent field across the country.
And I'd say that another aspect is that we've seen some advancements in the ability to forecast distributed PV, and as Ben mentioned, that there's some limitations to that and some needs for improving that. But then there's additional distributed generation resources that we also could be forecasting for. And then there's this question of what if you have customers who are adopting distributed PV also adopting other technologies that might go with that. And so there's maybe some need for increasing the ability to forecast not just distributed PV adoption, but also adoption of other things too, like electric vehicles or changing some of their appliances in response to that. So sort of being able to kind of get a more rich representation of decisions made by customers in planning, I think is an area that continues to be important. And with that, I'm sorry, we have a few questions still left. We'll mark those down and try to follow up with the individual questioners, but we're at the top of the hour now. And so we'd like to thank all of you for participating in this webinar. If you do have additional questions, we're happy to field them via email or to talk to you one-on-one. You have my contact information shown on the slide there, and I can help direct you to the right people on the team to talk to you further about this. But again, I wanted to appreciate all of you coming and joining and bringing your questions for this, and we look forward to talking with you about this more and future interactions on it. So thanks, and have a great day.